According to supporters of the historical status quo, Billy the Kid was shot and killed on July 14, 1881, at Fort Sumner, New Mexico, by Lincoln County Sheriff Pat F. Garrett. In support of their claim, they cite the published accounts of Pat Garrett and John W. Poe. Surprisingly, these two accounts contain numerous contradictions, errors, and omissions. In defense, these supporters claim that these are the only first-hand accounts of the events of July 14, 1881. However, another version does exist, in the form of William Henry Roberts' tape-recorded interview with William B. Morrison. Parts of this interview first appeared in Alias Billy the Kid by William B. Morrison and C.L. Sonnichsen in 1955. In this episode, I will examine the statements made by Roberts and see if they can be verified by sources. I will also present the accounts given by Pat Garrett and John Poe, as well as do a detailed analysis of all the events and evidence surrounding the night in question. With that said, let us begin. The version most often cited when discussing the events of the night Billy the Kid was purportedly killed comes from Pat Garrett's account, which was published in his book, The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid, which was published in 1882. The book was actually written by Garrett's friend, Ash Upson. Here's Garrett's account of the shooting. According to Garrett, in early July, he along with deputies John Poe and Thomas McKinney set off for Arizona to tend to some unspecified business, and planned to meet a man by the name of Wayne Brazel at the mouth of Taban Arroyo on the evening of July 13, 1881. After completing their business in Arizona, the men left Roswell, New Mexico on July 10th and started up the Rio Pecos to meet Brazel. During this time, the three lawmen traveled mainly at night, avoiding roads, preferring unfrequented routes. They arrived at the mouth of Taban Arroyo, which was about 5 miles south of Fort Sumner, 1 hour after dark, and waited for 2 hours, but Brazel never showed. The men then rode a mile or two towards Fort Sumner and made camp for the night. The next morning, Garrett sent Poe, who was not known in the area, into Fort Sumner to see if he could learn any information about the kid's whereabouts. He also told Poe to go to Sunnyside, about 7 miles north of Fort Sumner, to meet a man named Milner Rudolph. Garrett then told Poe to meet back up with he and McKinney at moonrise at La Punta de la Glorieta, 4 miles north of Fort Sumner. Later that night, the men met as planned. According to Garrett, Poe wasn't able to learn much from his conversation with Rudolph or from his poking around Fort Sumner, so Garrett decided to pay a visit to Pete Maxwell. On the way to Maxwell's, they met a man by the name of Jacobs, who was a friend of Poe's from Texas, who made camp just a short distance from Maxwell's grounds. From there, the three lawmen made their way on foot to Maxwell's house by way of the peach orchard, which runs down to a row of buildings occupied by Mexicans about 60 yards from Maxwell's home. Garrett then stated, quote, "We approached the houses cautiously, and when within earshot, heard the sound of voices conversing in Spanish. We concealed ourselves quickly and listened, but the distance was too great to hear words or even distinguish voices. Soon, a man arose from the ground, in full view, but too far away to recognize. He wore a broad-brimmed hat, a dark vest and pants, and was in his shirt sleeves. With a few words, which fell like a murmur on our ears, he went to the fence, jumped it, and walked down towards Maxwell's house. Little as we then suspected it, this man was the kid. We learned subsequently that when he left his companions that night, he went to the house of a Mexican friend, pulled off his hat and boots, threw himself on a bed, and commenced reading a newspaper. He soon, however, hailed his friend, who was sleeping in the room, told him to get up and make some coffee, adding, "Give me a butcher knife, and I will go over to Pete's and get some beef. I'm hungry." The Mexican arose, handed him the knife, and the kid, hatless and in his stocking feet, started to Maxwell's, which was but a few steps distant. When the kid, by me unrecognized, left the orchard, I motioned to my companions, and we cautiously retreated a short distance and took another route, approaching Maxwell's house from the opposite direction. When we reached the porch in front of the building, I left Poe and McKinney at the end of the porch, about 20 feet from the door of Pete's room, and went in. It was near midnight, and Pete was in bed. I walked to the head of the bed and sat down on it beside him, near the pillow. I asked him as to the whereabouts of the kid. He said that the kid had certainly been about, but he did not know whether he had left or not. At that moment, a man sprang quickly into the door, looking back, and called twice in Spanish, "Who comes there?" No one replied, and he came on in. He was bareheaded. From his step I could perceive he was either barefooted or in his stocking feet, and held a revolver in his right hand and a butcher knife in his left. He came directly towards me. Before he reached the bed, I whispered, "Who is it, Pete?" but received no reply for a moment. It struck me that it might be Manuel Abreu, who had seen Poe and McKinney and wanted to know their business. The intruder came close to me, leaned both hands on the bed, his right hand almost touching my knee, and asked in a low tone, "Who are they, Pete?" At the same instant, Maxwell whispered to me, "That's him." Simultaneously, the kid must have seen or felt the presence of a third person at the head of the bed. He raised quickly his pistol, a self-cocker, within a foot of my breast. Retreating rapidly across the room, he cried, "Kines, Kines! Who's that? Who's that?" All this occurred in a moment. Quickly as possible, I drew my revolver and fired, threw my body aside, and fired again. The second shot was useless. The kid fell dead. He never spoke. A struggle or two, a little straggling sound as he gasped for breath, and the kid was with his many victims. Maxwell had plunged over the foot of the bed on the floor, dragging the bedclothes with him. I went to the door and met Poe and McKinney there. Maxwell rushed past me, out on the porch. They threw their guns down on him, when he cried, "Don't shoot! Don't shoot!" I told my companions I had got the kid. They asked me if I had not shot the wrong man. I told them I had made no blunder, that I knew the kid's voice too well to be mistaken. The kid was entirely unknown to either of them. They had seen him pass in, and as he stepped on the porch, McKinney, who was sitting, rose to his feet. One of his spurs caught under the boards and nearly threw him. The kid laughed, but probably saw their guns, as he drew his revolver and sprang into the doorway, as he hailed, "Who comes there?" Seeing a bareheaded, barefooted man in his shirt sleeves with a butcher knife in his hand, and hearing his hail in excellent Spanish, they naturally supposed him to be a Mexican and an attaché of establishment, hence their suspicion that I had shot the wrong man. We now entered the room and examined the body. The ball struck him just above the heart and must have cut through the ventricles. Poe asked me how many shots I fired. I told him 2, but that I had no idea where the second one went. Both Poe and McKinney said the kid must have fired then, as there were surely 3 shots fired. I told them that he had fired 1 shot between my 2. We examined his pistol, a self-cocker, caliber .41. End quote. The second most cited account is John W. Poe's version, titled The Death of Billy the Kid, which was originally published in a magazine format in 1919 and then as a private printing in 1922 before being published in book form in 1933. Here is Poe's account of the shooting. John Poe, who had been a U.S. Marshal and Deputy Sheriff, was hired by the Canadian River Cattle Association to go to New Mexico to track down cattle rustlers, like Billy the Kid. Poe arrived in Lincoln County in March 1881 and met with Garrett, who deputized him, and the two agreed to cooperate with one another in rounding up cattle thieves. According to Poe, after Billy's escape from the Lincoln County jail, a posse was formed, and they attempted to track the kid, with no success, believing he left the country for Old Mexico. Then, in early July, while Poe was in White Oaks, he was approached by a man he knew from Texas, who told him that he had information that Billy the Kid was staying in Fort Sumner. Poe then went to Lincoln and informed Garrett of this information, who didn't believe it, but reluctantly agreed to go to Fort Sumner and investigate it. The two lawmen then traveled to Roswell and met up with Deputy Sheriff Thomas McKinney before heading to Fort Sumner. The men left Roswell at sundown and traveled until around midnight, when they made camp for the night. The next day, they rode between 50 and 55 miles, making camp late in the evening, about 5 or 6 miles outside of Fort Sumner. The next morning, it was decided that since Poe wouldn't be recognized by the locals, he would enter Fort Sumner and see if he could gather any information on the kid's whereabouts. Poe arrived at Fort Sumner about 10 o'clock in the morning and was met with suspicion and wasn't able to learn anything meaningful. He spent most of the day loitering around the village, making small talk, stopping in a saloon, and having a meal in a restaurant. He told them he was a miner from White Oaks passing through on his way to the Panhandle. He noted that the atmosphere seemed tense. After he was unable to learn anything at Fort Sumner, he headed for Sunnyside, 7 miles north of Fort Sumner, to meet with Garrett's friend Milner Rudolph. The meeting with Rudolph didn't amount to much. He said that Rudolph seemed nervous and excited, and said he didn't think the kid was in Fort Sumner. Poe then says in hindsight, he believes that Rudolph knew the kid was in Fort Sumner and was covering for him. Poe then left Rudolph's and met back up with Garrett and McKinney. Poe then says that despite his lack of success in obtaining any useful information, he was more convinced than ever that the kid was in Fort Sumner. After meeting back up with Garrett and McKinney, the three men then entered a grove of trees near Fort Sumner, concealed their horses, and then stationed themselves in the peach orchard at the rear of Maxwell's house. The men then watched Maxwell's house because Garrett said that if Billy was in Fort Sumner, he would most likely visit Maxwell's house. However, according to Poe, Garrett wasn't confident that their mission would succeed. The men took up their lookout position along the edge of the orchard at about 9 o'clock. At about 11 o'clock, Garrett declared that he believed they were on a cold trail and proposed that they leave before anyone saw them. Poe then claims that he convinced Garrett to visit with Pete Maxwell before leaving. It is at this point that Poe reveals he has never seen or met Maxwell, only knowing him by reputation. He then states, quote, "Upon arriving at the residence, Garrett said to me, 'This is Maxwell's room in this corner. You fellows wait here while I go talk to him.' Thereupon, he stepped onto the porch and entered Maxwell's room through the open door, while McKinney and myself stopped on the outside. McKinney squatted on the outside of the fence, and I sat on the edge of the porch in the small open gateway leading from the street onto the porch. It should be mentioned here that up to this moment, I had never seen Billy the Kid, nor Maxwell, which fact, in view of the events transpiring immediately afterward, placed me in an extreme disadvantage. It was not more than 30 seconds after Garrett had entered Maxwell's room when my attention was attracted, from where I sat in the little gateway, to a man approaching me on the inside of and along the fence, some 40 or 50 steps away. I observed that he was partially dressed and was both bareheaded and barefooted, rather, had only socks on his feet, and it seemed to me that he was fastening his trousers as he came toward me at a very brisk walk. As Maxwell's was the only place in Fort Sumner that I had considered above suspicion of harboring the kid, I was entirely off my guard, the thought coming into my mind that the man approaching me was either Maxwell or some guest of his who might have been staying there. He came on until he was almost within arm's length of where I sat before he saw me. As I was partially concealed from his view by the post of the gate, upon his seeing me, he covered me with his 6-shooter as quick as lightning, sprang onto the porch, calling in Spanish, "Canes, who is it?" at the same time backing away from me toward the door through which Garrett only a few seconds before had passed, repeating his query, "Who is it?" in Spanish several times. At this I stood up and advanced toward him, telling him not to be alarmed, that he should not be hurt, and still without the least suspicion that this was the very man we were looking for. As I moved toward him trying to reassure him, he backed up into the doorway of Maxwell's room, where he halted for a moment, his body concealed by the thick adobe wall at the side of the doorway, from whence he put his head out and asked in Spanish for the 4th or 5th time who I was. I was within a few feet of him when he disappeared into the room. After this, and until after the shooting, I was unable to see what took place of the darkness of the room, but plainly heard what was said on the inside. An instant after the man left the door, I heard a voice inquire in a sharp tone, "Pete, who are those fellows on the outside?" An instant later, a shot was fired in the room, followed immediately by what everyone within hearing distance thought was 2 other shots. However, there was only 2 shots fired, the third report, as we learned afterward, being caused by the rebound of the second bullet, which had struck the adobe wall and rebounded against the headboard of a wooden bedstand. I heard a groan and 1 or 2 gasps from where I stood in the doorway, as of someone dying in the room. An instant later, Garrett came out, brushing against me as he passed. He stood by me close to the wall, at the side of the door, and said to me, "That was the kid that came in there onto me, and I think I have got him." I said, "Pat, the kid would not come to this place. You have shot the wrong man." Upon me saying this, Garrett seemed to be in doubt himself as to whom he had shot, but quickly spoke up and said, "I am sure that was him, for I know his voice too well to be mistaken." This remark of Garrett's relieved me of considerable apprehension, as I felt almost certain that someone whom we did not want to have been killed. A moment after Garrett came out of the door, Pete Maxwell rushed squarely onto me in a frantic effort to get out of the room, and I certainly would have shot him but for Garrett striking my gun down, saying, "Don't shoot Maxwell." By this time, all was quiet within the room, and as the darkness was such that we were unable to see what the conditions were on the inside or what the result of the shooting had been, we, after some rather forceful persuasion indeed, induced Maxwell to procure a light, which he finally did by bringing an old-fashioned tallow candle from his mother's room at the far end of the building, passing by the rear to the end where the shooting occurred, and placing the candle on the window sill from the outside. This enabled us to get a view of the inside, where we saw a man lying stretched upon his back dead in the middle of the room, with a six-shooter laying at his right hand and a butcher knife at his left. Upon examining the body, we found it to be that of Billy the Kid. Garrett's first shot had penetrated his breast just above the heart, thus ending the career of a desperado who, while only 23 years of age at the time of his death, had killed a greater number of men than any of the many desperados and killers I have known or heard of during the 45 years I have been in the Southwest." End quote. William Henry Roberts' account of the shooting was taken from the transcripts of his tape-recorded interviews with William B. Morrison, which were originally published in the book Alias Billy the Kid by William B. Morrison and C.L. Saunderson in 1955. Here is Roberts' account in his own words. Quote, "I rode into Fort Sumner from Yerby's a few days before Garrett and his posse rode in. When they rode in that day, I had spent the day with Garrett's brother-in-law, Saville Gutierrez. Nearly all the people in this country were my friends, and they helped me. None of them liked Garrett. It was dark that night, but there was enough moonlight to make shadows. Me and my partner, Billy Barlow, rode up to Jesus Silva's house when we reached Fort Sumner. We had been staying out at the Yerby Ranch, laying low for a while. Word was all around that Pat Garrett and his posse were after me. Pat's wife was a sister to my friend, Saville Gutierrez, and Saville told me that Pat was after me, that he had heard it from his sister. Things were mighty hot in Lincoln County for me right about then, but I wasn't running from it. I meant to have a talk with Pat Garrett and set things straight between us if I could. We used to be friends. We hid our horses in the barn and walked up to Jesus' back door. Barlow was nervous about being in Fort Sumner with me, and I couldn't blame him much. Jesus came to the back door when I tapped on it with the barrel of my six-shooter. When he saw that it was me, he grinned and let us in. I told Jesus we were hungry. We had been out in the hills all day scouting around Fort Sumner for any sign of Garrett and his posse. "I have nothing but cold frijoles, compadre," Jesus whispered as he closed the door. Barlow made a sour face. "I want some meat," he said. "We've been living on beans and tortillas all week. Ain't you got any beef?" Jesus shrugged. "Senor Maxwell has a hindquarter on his back porch, killed only yesterday. You can cut some strips as I start the fire, as I warm up the frijoles and tortillas." I didn't like the idea. We were safe inside the house with our horses hidden in the barn. I figured we ought to leave things like they were until morning, and I said so. "Beans are okay with me. Let's wait, Billy." Barlow was in a foul mood. We'd been on the dodge since I broke out of jail, and things weren't going to suit him. He had his mind made up to have beefsteak, and I couldn't talk him out of it. "I'm going over to Maxwell's," he said. "Hand me that butcher knife. I'll go by myself. I'm sick and tired of eating beans." Barlow took the butcher knife and started for the door. I had this crazy feeling that he had not a go, like something whispered in my ear that it was all wrong and there might be some trouble out there. "Stay put," I said. "It can wait till morning." But he went out anyway, like he hadn't heard a word I said to him. I watched Jesus light a fire in the wood stove. I wasn't thinking about Barlow or much of anything else, just resting against the kitchen wall. Suddenly there was a gunshot. I went stiff and jerked away from the wall. The shot had come from the direction of Pete Maxwell's place. I pulled one of my 44s and ran through the door, trying to see in the dark. 2 more shots came from a shadow beside the Maxwell house. I couldn't find a target to shoot at. It was too dark to see. I ran toward Maxwell's back porch. I heard another gunshot and felt something hit me in the jaw. I stumbled and kept on running with a broken tooth rolling around in my tongue. I tasted blood and spit the mess out of my mouth as I started emptying my 6-shooter at the shadow where I saw the muzzle flash. From the corner of my eye, I saw a body lying on the back porch. I knew it had to be Barlow. My partner had walked right into a trap, and the trap had likely been set for me. I pulled my other .44 and ran toward the porch to check on Barlow, but I ran into a wall of gunfire. I knew I wasn't going to make it to my partner. Too many guns were shooting at me. I didn't have a chance. I turned for a fence across the back of Maxwell's yard and dove for it when a bullet caught me in the left shoulder. I jumped over the fence and landed hard on the far side with the echo of gunshots all around me, ringing in my ears. I staggered into an alley that ran behind the house, firing my .44 over my shoulder until it clicked empty. My mouth and shoulder were bleeding and I lost track of where I was, but I knew I had to get away from Maxwell's before they killed me. I heard a shout and another gunshot. Something passed across my forehead like a hot branding iron. I was stunned. I lost my footing and fell on my face in the darkness. I knew I was hurt bad, and I wondered if I would make it out of this scrape alive. I forced myself up again, wiping the blood from my eyes with my shirt sleeve as I stumbled headlong down the alley. I didn't know how bad the head wound was, only that it was bleeding and I couldn't see. It wouldn't matter if they found me in the alley just then. They were bent on killing me, to be sure. If I fell again, I knew they'd find me and finish the job, so I kept running down the alley as hard as I could, barely able to see where I was going. I heard them shouting to each other behind me, arguing over something, but I was too woozy to think about what they were saying and too frightened to care. The gunshot to my head had knocked me senseless. I kept on staggering and running down the alley, trying to get away. Blood was pouring into my eyes. I couldn't see a thing. I ran past a little adobe shack down the alley from Pete Maxwell's. I suppose all the shooting woke everybody up, because a door opened just a crack when I ran behind the adobe, and I could see a lantern light spilling from the doorway across the alley. I stumbled toward the light, not knowing what else to do. I needed help, and the open door was the only place I could find, hurt like I was. A Mexican woman pulled me inside. She saw the blood on my face and threw her hands over her mouth. She closed the door quickly and helped me to a chair. I sleeved the blood from my eyes, watching her, loading my Colts. Blood was coming from my mouth, and where the bullets hit my jaw and my shoulder was throbbing with the pain of the slug that went through me. All of a sudden, things started going black all around me. "Help me," I said, gasping for air. "Put something on the wounds to stop the bleeding. I've got to get the hell away from here before they find me. My horse is in Jesus' barn. I need someone to saddle it for me. They shot my partner. Please help me." Before the woman could answer, I blacked out cold. When I woke up, the woman was putting beef tallow on my forehead to stop the blood. I saw another woman in the room, and when my vision cleared, I recognized her. She was Celsa Gutierrez, and she had been a sweetheart of mine one time. "Where are they?" I asked, remembering the ambush and my escape down the alley. "Inside Maxwell's house," she whispered. "They are afraid to come out in the dark. They think some of your friends will try to shoot them. You have many friends here, Billy. Pat and his men said they won't leave the house until daylight." Celsa confirmed what I had already guessed. Garrett and a posse had been laying for me over at Maxwell's. They knew Pete and I were friends, and that I'd stop by to see him if I was in this country. I sent for Frank Labato. Celsa whispered, "He is saddling your horse. He will bring it to the alley when I tell him that you are able to ride." "Tell him to bring it around to the side," I said. "I've got to get away from here before they start looking for me." Celsa smiled. "Don't worry, Billy. Pat is telling everyone that you are dead. They took the body of your friend inside the house, and they say it is yours. Some men from town have already been sent to dig a grave by lantern light. Delavina Maxwell is crying and carrying on, but she knows Pat killed the wrong man. She is pretending, going along with what the men are saying. Your partner looks very much like you in the dark, except for his beard. His eyes are blue like yours, Billy. Pat says they will bury the body in the morning. If the coffin is closed, who will guess that you are not inside it?" I couldn't figure it right then, hearing what Celsa was saying about Garrett. Was he trying to pass off Barlow's body as mine? We were friends. He knew the body wasn't mine, so why was he telling everybody that he had killed me? Celsa left by the back door. The Mexican woman tied a bandage around my shoulder and put more tallow on my forehead until I heard horses come up to the side of the adobe. I hobbled through the door and around the corner to where Frank Lobato was waiting with 2 horses. He helped me in the saddle, and we rode quietly away from the adobe, keeping the house between us and Maxwell's. When we were away from town, I started puzzling over what Celsa had told me. Garrett was trying to pass off Barlow's body as that of mine. I wondered how he figured to get away with it. Garrett knew by now that he'd killed the wrong man in the dark. Billy Barlow looked a lot like me, the same size and general description, with blue eyes like mine. But in the daylight, a lot of folks who knew me would know that they had the wrong body. I couldn't figure it, unless Garrett realized his mistake and was making a try at collecting the reward that was out on me anyway." End quote. It is my contention that Billy the Kid was not killed by Pat Garrett on the evening of July 14, 1881, that another man was mistakenly killed and a cover-up immediately transpired. What follows is why I believe this. According to supporters of the historical status quo, one of the most hard-hitting pieces of evidence that Billy the Kid was killed by Garrett is the coroner's jury verdict. According to most published accounts, there were 2 different and distinct coroner's verdicts rendered in the purported death of Billy the Kid. However, researchers and historians are not united in their beliefs and remain divided into 3 groups. The facts are set forth as follows. William H. Bonney, alias Billy the Kid, was purportedly shot in the dark by Pat Garrett in the home of Pete Maxwell at Fort Sumner, San Miguel County, Territory of New Mexico, on the night of July 14, 1881. Pat Garrett was sheriff of Lincoln County, not San Miguel County, the site of the alleged killing. Garrett failed to make a report with San Miguel County Sheriff Hilario Romero with regard to the facts of this act. Garrett, by his own admission, had carefully planned his mission to San Miguel County in anticipation of taking the kid. Yet, he failed to take up the matter with the proper authorities, with presiding jurisdiction of that locality. It has been reported that the body of the kid was buried on the night of the killing, the day following the killing, and even one far-fetched story, the body wasn't interred for 2 days after the shooting. There is no legal record to support any of these contentions. The 3 groups earlier mentioned shall be labeled as follows: the Anaya group, the Rudolph group, and the unilateral group. Their beliefs and theories are as follows. The Rudolph group, this is by far the most widely accepted version parroted by supporters of the historical status quo. The report was said to have been entirely written in Spanish and stated, quote, "This 15th day of July A.D., 1881, I, the undersigned Justice of the Peace of the precinct above named, received information that there had been a death in Fort Sumner in said precinct, and immediately on receiving the information, I proceeded to the said place and named Milner Rudolph, Jose Silva, Antonio Savadra, Pedro Antonio Lucero, Lorenzo Jaramillo, and Saville Gutierrez, a jury to investigate the matter, and meeting in the house of Lucien B. Maxwell, the said jury proceeded to a room in said house, where they found the body of William H. Bonney, alias Kid, with a bullet wound in the chest, and having examined the body, they examined the evidence of Pedro Maxwell, which evidence is as follows. As I was lying on my bed in my room about midnight on the 14th day of July, Patrick F. Garrett entered my room and sat down on the edge of my bed to talk to me. Soon after Garrett had seated himself, William Bonney entered and approached my bed with a pistol in his hand and asked me, "Who is it? Who is it?" And then Patrick F. Garrett fired 2 shots at him. The said William Bonney and the said Bonney fell upon one side of my fireplace, and I left the room. When I returned 3 or 4 minutes after the shots, the said Bonney was dead. The jury was found the following verdict. We of the jury unanimously find that William Bonney was killed by a shot in the left breast, in the region of the heart, fired from a pistol in the hand of Patrick F. Garrett, and our verdict is that the act of the said Garrett was justifiable homicide, and we are unanimous in the opinion that the gratitude of the whole community is due to the said Garrett for his act, and he deserves to be rewarded." End quote. It was signed by Milner Rudolph, President, Antonio Savadra, Pedro Anto Lucero, Jose Silva, Sabal Gutierrez, Lorenzo Jaramillo, all of which information I bring to your notice. Alejandro Segura, Justice of the Peace." End quote. The Anaya Group. According to former New Mexico state legislator and Fort Sumner resident, A.P. Anaya, the Rudolph verdict was a product of fiction, and the true verdict was written by Pat Garrett in English as opposed to Spanish. He maintained that the true verdict stated simply that, quote, "We the jury find that Billy the Kid met his death by a bullet which was fired from a gun in the hands of Pat F. Garrett. Signed, Ino Garcia, President, Antonio Saavedra, Jose Silva, Sabal Gutierrez, Lorenzo Jaramillo, A.P. Anaya, Alejandro Segura, Justice of the Peace." End quote. As evidence that the Rudolph verdict was invalid, Mr. Anaya stated that, quote, "The report written in Spanish uses two men that did not even live in Fort Sumner. Rudolph, he lived in Rosiata since the year 1880, and in the month of May, Don Luis Rudolph moved to Rosiata, and in this time, the younger Rudolph would be 14 years old when Billy the Kid was killed. The other, Pedro Antonio Lucero, this man never lived in Fort Sumner, and not only that, but up until now, no Pedro Antonio Lucero has ever lived in Fort Sumner. And I say this because in 1879, I was the registrar in the time of the elections until 1889. Later, I was the registrar from 1905 until 1920. From then until now, I have lived in Vaughn, New Mexico. I was the registrar in 1918 for the government, and I never knew any Pedro Antonio Lucero that had lived in Fort Sumner. And for this reason I say that the jury in Spanish was made by Don Pedro Maxwell and Don Manuel Abreu to back up Pat Garrett that he lost the verdict that he himself wrote." End quote. The Unilateral Group maintains that both verdicts were rendered and that Garrett innocently lost the first report, resulting in the creation of the second verdict. Many problems exist with regard to both verdicts. First of all, no one has ever seen either document. By Anaya's own admission, the verdict he purports to be genuine was lost and never filed, and therefore has never been available for proper examination. Author Maurice G. Fulton claims that during the 1930s, he located a photostatic copy of the Rudolph verdict in the office of the Commissioner of Public Lands, located inside the Capitol building in Santa Fe, New Mexico. This claim has never been substantiated, its authenticity never verified. To date, no one has ever seen it. The document to which Fulton refers is merely a purported copy of a purported copy. Many supporters of the historical status quo fail to make mention of this fact when citing it as a source. Furthermore, here are a few questions to ponder when considering the legitimacy of the copy of the purported copy. If it is genuine, what became of the original? Who made the copy, and why had previous researchers been unable to locate it? And why does the state of New Mexico refuse to recognize it as being genuine? These are all legitimate questions which warrant being addressed. In addition, I don't believe it was possible to make photostatic copies in 1881. There is further evidence which indicates that the Rudolph verdict was not authentic. According to William A. Kelleher, the Rudolph account was written in Spanish and attached to a cover letter written by Garrett. Curiously, in the copy purportedly found by Fulton, the words spoken by the man who entered Maxwell's room were in English, "Who is it? Who is it?" and not in Spanish, "Quines, Quines," as stated by Garrett. Apparently, some of the purported signers of the document had difficulty signing or remembering their own names. For instance, Jose Silva was misspelled Jose Silva, and Sabal Gutierrez was misspelled Sabal Gutierrez. This results in two possibilities. Either both men misspelled their own names, or their signatures were forged. A supporter of the historical status quo has suggested to me that it is possible that these two men were illiterate and someone else signed for them. While this scenario is possible, I have been unable to verify that either man was illiterate via census and land records containing an X as a signature in San Miguel County. Furthermore, as stated previously, Fort Sumner was a very small and tight-knit community and was predominantly comprised of Mexicans. Certainly the signers of the document would not have made such a blunder as to confuse Silva for Silva or Sabal for Saval. Alejandro Segura, Justice of the Peace, who supposedly headed the proceedings to both verdicts, failed to record or make even the slightest mention of any coroner's jury verdict in his record books. I contend that if he presided over such a momentous event as to the death of the most famous outlaw in the history of the Southwest, he certainly would have made a note of it. There is also no entry in any of the court minute books in San Miguel County or any county in New Mexico. It is difficult to believe that a jury comprised largely of men known to be on friendly terms with the kid would be so inclined to recommend that Pat Garrett be rewarded for slaying him. To prove that no record exists in the matter of the death of Billy the Kid, I would like to cite the following statements made by New Mexico state officials in the matter of the purported coroner's verdicts. Quote, "Dear Sir, I wish to acknowledge receipt of your letter of August 9, 1951, requesting a certified copy of the coroner's verdict on the death of William H. Bonney, alias Billy the Kid. I am sorry I cannot comply with your request because of the fact that such a record is not now and never has been among the records of this office." End quote. This letter was dated August 14, 1951, from Jose Armillo, District Attorney of the 4th Judicial District, counties of San Miguel, Mora, and Guadalupe, Las Vegas, New Mexico, to William B. Morrison. Quote, "I, Cecil W. Williams, County Clerk within and for the County of Debaca, State of New Mexico, do hereby certify that I have searched the records in my office and I fail to find anything pertaining to a coroner's jury verdict in the case of Billy the Kid." Letter dated August 21st, 1951, from Cecil W. Williams, County Clerk, Debaca County, Fort Sumner, New Mexico, to William V. Morrison. Quote, "I, Jose Masteas, County Clerk within and for the County of Guadalupe, State of New Mexico, do hereby certify that I have searched the records in my office, and I fail to find anything pertaining to the coroner's jury verdict in the case of Billy the Kid." End quote. Letter dated August 21st, 1951, from Jose Masteas, Jr., County Clerk, Guadalupe County, Santa Rosa, New Mexico, to William B. Morrison. Quote, "Dear Mr. Morrison, I sent your letter requesting the coroner's verdict of the purported death of William H. Bonney to the clerk of the District Court of Debaca County, as there is no record in this office of any coroner's verdict, and we do not have the records of Debaca County in this office." End quote. Letter dated October 31st, 1949, from Miss Carmen Armillo, Deputy District County Clerk, Las Vegas, New Mexico, to William B. Morrison. Quote, "Dear Mr. Morrison, this will acknowledge receipt of your letter dated November 12th. Our records failed to disclose the death record or coroner's report with reference to the purported death of William H. Bonney, alias the Kid, alias William Antrim." End quote. Letter dated November 21st, 1949, from Alicia Romero, Secretary of State, Santa Fe, New Mexico, to William B. Morrison. While the state of New Mexico doesn't have any record of the coroner's jury verdict, interestingly, they did acknowledge that not only did the territory not consider the kid dead in 1881, they were still issuing indictments and warrants for his arrest in 1882 and 1883. The 1882 indictment and warrant was issued on December 20th, 1882 in San Miguel County, and the 1883 warrant was issued on March the 5th, 1883, also in San Miguel County. These documents originally appeared in Billy the Kid and Me Were the Same by William A. Tunstall in 1988. According to Pat Garrett and John Poe, the man killed by Garrett was armed with a .41 double-action revolver. During an interview with William B. Morrison, William Henry Roberts spoke a great deal about the weapons he used, stating, quote, "I did not shoot anything but single-action pistols. They were surefire, and I was raised to them. Double actions were not surefire and not as quick in a jam. They got many a man killed, they did." End quote. He also told Morrison that when he hit a man, he, quote, "wanted him to stay down." End quote. Author W.C. Jamison poses a very good question regarding the identity of the man killed by Garrett, stating, quote, "If the stranger was the Kid, why was he carrying a .41 caliber pistol when the outlaw always used .44s? It is a fact that when the Kid escaped from the Lincoln County Jail, he took 2 .44s from the armory." End quote. Following his capture at Stinking Springs on December 21st, 1880, Billy the Kid was disarmed. He was carrying a Colt single-action .44 caliber Frontier model, serial number 0361, made in 1874. At the time of his death, William Henry Roberts was in possession of a Colt single-action .44 Frontier model, serial number 176903. Both of these weapons were chambered to fire rifle ammunition. Following the shooting in Maxwell's bedroom, Poe stated, quote, "Pat, the kid would not come to this place. You have shot the wrong man." Upon me saying this, Garrett seemed to be in doubt himself as to whom he had shot, but quickly spoke up and said, "I am sure that was him, for I know his voice too well to be mistaken." End quote. Poe, by his own admission, stated in his version of the killing that he had never seen Billy the Kid or Pete Maxwell. Therefore, Poe had to rely solely on Garrett to identify Billy, alive or dead. But Poe was convinced that the man killed by Garrett wasn't the kid. Why? Because he was on guard just outside the door, and while he hadn't seen the kid, he most certainly had a description of him. Yet, the unidentified man was allowed to walk past both Poe and McKinney. Isn't it logical to presume that if this man matched the kid's description, they wouldn't have permitted him to pass? Is it logical to presume that Poe and McKinney would let a total stranger, armed with a gun and having it drawn, enter the room where their fellow lawman was? It is my opinion that the unidentified man was not armed with anything other than a butcher knife, and the .41 revolver found at the scene was nothing more than a drop weapon. The only logical conclusion is that Poe and McKinney stopped the man, talked with him, and were satisfied with who he was, or at the very least, were satisfied that he wasn't Billy the Kid. Most researchers that believe William Henry Roberts to be the real Billy the Kid do not believe that Billy the Kid's escape from Fort Sumner on the night in question was the result of any premeditated conspiracy mutually agreed upon by Garrett and the Kid. We believe it was purely a case of mistaken identity on an account of Garrett's shoot first and identify them later methods. This fact can be verified simply by examining Garrett's previous killings, as follows. Tom Fired was shot and killed by Garrett and his posse on the evening of December 19, 1880, at Fort Sumner, New Mexico. Fired was ambushed in the dark amidst a snowstorm because he was riding in the position usually occupied by Billy the Kid. This was the first time Garrett thought he killed the kid, based solely on the riding position of the target. Charlie Beaudry was shot and killed by Garrett and his posse at Stinking Springs on December 21, 1880. Beaudry was ambushed as he emerged from the stone enclosure, armed with a feed bag to feed the horses. Garrett identified him as Billy the Kid because of the hat he was wearing and opened fire, mortally wounding Beaudry. This constitutes the second time he thought he killed Billy the Kid. The point of this being is to prove to you that Garrett had thought he killed Billy the Kid 2 times prior to July 14, 1881. The difference in the matter is that Fired and Beaudry were wanted men, and therefore these mistake killings could be excused. However, if Billy Barlow were indeed the man killed on July 14, 1881, the situation would be completely different, as Barlow was not an outlaw or a wanted man. Furthermore, many residents of Fort Sumner were known to be hostile towards Garrett. Fort Sumner was predominantly occupied by Mexicans, and it is unlikely that its citizens would take too kindly to the murder of a man of Mexican or half-Mexican ethnicity by an Anglo, especially an Anglo who wasn't well liked. The following is an obituary, which appeared in the New Southwest and Grant County Herald of Silver City, New Mexico, dated Saturday, July 18, 1881. It was titled Exit the Kid by S.M. Ashenfelter, editor and proprietor. It stated, quote, "The vulgar murderer and desperado known as Billy the Kid has met his just deserts at last. He was shot and killed at the house of Pete Maxwell near Fort Sumner at midnight, Thursday the 14th instant, by Sheriff Pat Garrett of Lincoln County. He was a native of New York City, of Irish parenting, and his real name was William McCarty, although he had been known as Henry Antrim, Billy Bonney, and other aliases. He lived in this city for some years with his mother, Mrs. Antrim, who has since died, and began his criminal life by acts of petty larceny. Since his escape from the Lincoln County Jail, he has allowed his beard to grow and has stained his skin brown to look like a Mexican. He had gone to the house of a friend that night for meat." End quote. Following his capture at Stinking Springs, 6 months prior to the shooting at Fort Sumner, Billy the Kid was held in the Las Vegas jail while he was awaiting transfer to the jail in Mesilla. At this time he was interviewed by J.H. Kugler, who recorded the following description of the outlaw in the December 28, 1880 edition of the Las Vegas Gazette, stating, quote, "There was nothing very mannish about him in appearance, for he looked and acted a mere boy. He is about 5 feet 8 or 9 inches tall, slightly built and lithe, weighing about 140, a frank and open countenance, looking like a schoolboy with the traditional silky fuzz on his upper lip, clear blue eyes with a roguish snap about them, light hair and complexion." End quote. According to Ashenfelter, the Kid disguised himself by staining his skin brown to look like a Mexican. Such a contention is absurd, as it is highly unlikely that grease paint or any other effective skin coloring agent was readily available in Fort Sumner in 1881. Based on the two descriptions provided by Ashenfelter and Kugler, it is logical to presume that the description of the body of the man shot that night could not logically have belonged to Billy the Kid. Medically speaking, Dr. J. M. Tanner, author of Growth and Adolescence, Sexual Maturity Stages, called SMRs, or Sexual Maturity Ratings, are developmental stages, not necessarily associated with chronological age. According to Dr. Tanner, the presence of silky fuzz occurs at SMR2, and the ability to grow a beard occurs at SMR5. If Billy the Kid, at age 20 to 21, was still exhibiting silky fuzz on his upper lip, this is an indication that he was experiencing delayed sexual maturity. According to Tanner's research, it is highly improbable that given the chronology of the SMR sequence, the Kid could have gone from silky fuzz to a dark beard in only 6 1/2 months. This information, in conjunction with the facts previously stated, caused grave doubts about the identity of the man killed that night. Tanner's research was originally cited in The Return of the Outlaw Billy the Kid by W.C. Jameson and Frederick Bean. Neo-historians will tell you that the Ashenfelter article is the only source to describe the man killed that night as having dark skin and a beard. However, another source does exist that confirms this as well. If you were to ask a neo-historian, what is the first book published about the life and times of Billy the Kid? Almost to a T, everyone will answer The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid by Pat Garrett. However, they would be wrong. While practically every biography of the Kid published after the Garrett book would be heavily influenced by the Garrett-Upson narrative, one book stands alone as not only being released before Garrett's book was published in 1882, but not being corrupted by its claims. That book is The True Life of Billy the Kid, the Noted New Mexican Outlaw or the Bold Bandit of the West by Edmund Fable, Jr., published in September 1881, approximately 2 months after the shooting at Fort Sumner. In Fable's book, it describes the man killed by Garrett as being dark-skinned and looking like a Mexican, just like the Ashenfelter account. Fable records the following, quote, "One day passed, 2, 3, 4, and a week, and still not a shadow of encouragement. The second week had set in when one morning chance threw the outlaw under the searching gaze of the officer. During the afternoon, a Mexican, gaily attired and riding a very fine horse, rode up to the fort and entered the store where he was soon engaged in a purchase of a box of cartridges. The sheriff, idling by, saw the man enter and was about to go on when something in the swaggering, easy devil-may-care gait of the Mexican arrested his attention and caused him to pause in his walk. The Mexican had concluded his purchase and was coming out of the store when Garrett concealed himself beside a freighter's wagon and watched the Mexican mount his horse and gallop away. Lounging into the store, he engaged the proprietor in conversation and asked him, in an indifferent way, the name of the man to whom he had sold the cartridges. "I don't know his name, but he's out here on Pete Maxwell's ranch." "What do you want to know for?" "Oh, nothing," carelessly Garrett replied. "I noticed he had a good horse, and I thought if I could meet him, we might strike up a trade." Saying this, he strolled out and busied himself making inquiries as to the location of Maxwell's ranch, and after he had satisfied himself, he engaged 2 men to accompany him and started after dinner for his prey. He was certain it was the Kid who come in the store. End quote. Fable then described the man, who would be killed that night, as having dark skin, stating, quote, "who had resorted to an old dodge of tanning his face to the copper-colored hue of a Mexican." End quote. According to William Henry Roberts, Billy Barlow and he were very similar in appearance. That is, the same approximate height and weight. However, Roberts told Morrison that Barlow was darker skinned and wore a beard. Dr. Sonnenson believed Barlow may have been half Mexican. This is very important, because at the time Roberts recorded this statement, neither he or Morrison knew about the Ashenfeller obituary. In fact, it is not cited in alias Billy the Kid, nor is it among the files in Roberts' application for pardon. In short, Roberts' description of Barlow coincides with Ashenfelter's description of the man killed. According to both Garrett and Poe, the man entered Maxwell's bedroom, repeatedly calling out, "Kines, Kines, who's there, who's there?" This is most interesting, since Billy Barlow was purportedly half Mexican. For if Billy the Kid, an Anglo, had entered the room, would he not be inclined to address Maxwell in English as opposed to Spanish? It is only logical to presume, since Pete Maxwell spoke excellent English and the intruder only spoke in Spanish, that the man was of Mexican ethnicity. Is it not absurd to presume that the kid, a fugitive on the run, with a sizable reward on his head, would be so naive as to ask, "Kines, Kines?" In addition, according to most historians, numerous residents had informed the kid of Garrett's presence in Fort Sumner. I find absolutely no logic in the notion that the kid would be so careless as to blunder about Maxwell's as the man killed by Garrett did. I contend that if the man killed by Garrett were indeed Billy the Kid, McKinney and Poe would have been shot without hesitation as they stood outside of Maxwell's, sticking out like sore thumbs. The burial of the man purported to be Billy the Kid is not without controversy. Like the coroner's jury verdict, the facts of the burial are sketchy, contradictory, and unverifiable. For instance, when exactly the body was removed from the room is in question. According to John Poe, the body was removed, quote, "a short time after the shooting and carried across the yard to a carpenter's shop, where it was laid out on a workbench, the women placing lighted candles around it, according to their ideas of properly conducting a wake for the dead." End quote. However, according to Charles Frederick Rudolph, Milner Rudolph's son, in his book, Los Belitos, The Story of Billy the Kid and His Gang, the body wasn't removed until the following day. This further complicates the credibility of the coroner's verdict, since according to Poe, the body was removed and prepared for burial on the 14th, a short time after the shooting, and the man who reportedly served on the jury claimed that he didn't arrive in Fort Sumner until the following day. According to research historian and author E.B. Mann, in Guns and the Gunfighters, only 3 men viewed the body, and 1 refused to identify the dead man as Billy the Kid. In the March 1980 edition of Frontier Times, it contains an article by Ben W. Kemp titled "Ride for Mexico Billy." Kemp was the nephew of Billy the Kid's friend, John Collins. In the article, Kemp writes of his uncle's account of the night the kid was reportedly killed by Garrett. According to John Collins, alias John Graham, former Fort Sumner resident and acquaintance of Billy the Kid, the body was removed from the room a short time after the shooting, and he and a Mexican were asked to dig the grave. When the wagon carrying the casket arrived, an armed guard with strict orders that no one was to open it accompanied it. Collins' account should not be taken lightly, as he is a known friend of the kid, and there is evidence that backs up Collins' claim. According to acclaimed Billy the Kid and Lincoln County war historian and author Frederick Nolan, in his book, The West of Billy the Kid, Nolan writes, quote, "While Poe was at Sunnyside, a man who went by the name John Collins, a former member of the kid's gang, headed for the sheep camp where the kid was hiding out to warn him that the law was in the area. On the way out, he met the kid coming in. 'Billy,' he warned, 'don't go down there. I just saw Poe and no doubt Garrett and a posse are around town looking for you.' The kid laughed it off. 'Oh, that's okay. I'll be all right,' he said, and rode on, leaving Collins bewildered. 'Didn't he care he might get killed?" End quote. Another legendary author and researcher, Philip J. Rash, also cites a similar account. In Trailing Billy the Kid, he writes, quote, "John Collins, alias Graham, former member of Billy's gang, headed for Lobato's camp to warn the outlaw that officers were in the vicinity. On the way he met the kid, bound for Fort Sumner. 'Billy,' he warned, "Don't go down there. I just saw Poe and no doubt Pat Garrett, and a posse are around town looking for you." The kid merely laughed, answered, "Oh, that's okay, I'll be all right," and rode on, leaving Collins very badly puzzled. End quote. A third credible source exists in the form of the book Cow Dust and Saddle Leather by J.C. Dykes, which also repeats Collins' account, stating that the man killed by Garrett, quote, "was not Billy the Kid." End quote. This places Collins in the area at the time he claimed, and his relationship with the kid grants further credence to this claim. To further compound the confusion is the fact that no one actually knows where the body of the man purported to be Billy the Kid was buried. In the book, They Knew Billy the Kid, by Robert Cadlick and J.C. Dykes, it contains an interview with Carlotta Baca. According to Baca, only a few people knew the location of the grave, and drunks and vandals used the original wooden marker as target practice. Additionally, in the years following the purported burial of Billy the Kid, the cemetery has been subjected to various grave relocation programs, and since the majority of bodies located in the Fort Sumner Cemetery were those of soldiers, most of them were disinterred and relocated to the Santa Fe National Cemetery. Many of these graves were unmarked and absent of any identification at the time of their relocation. Furthermore, the Fort Sumner Cemetery is located on the Pecos River floodplain and has been subjected to numerous instances of intense flooding, oftentimes carrying grave markers, headstones, and even caskets many miles downstream. In a letter dated April 28, 1981, from George E. Kaiser of Artesia, New Mexico, to William A. Tunstall, Kaiser, who was the vice president of the New Mexico Historical Society, wrote, quote, "To get to the question of exhumation of Billy's purported grave, in August of 1927, following summer school at the University of Oklahoma, my family went to see the grave of Billy the Kid. There was full agreement at Fort Sumner as to where the grave was, but the question was, which of the two graves was Billy's? We went as directed down the west side of the river several miles to the grave site. We found the two graves, about 4 feet apart. They were greatly weathered mounds of dirt, not very high at this time. There was no marker of any kind and no fence and no sign that any effort had been made through the years to care for the graves. We were told one grave was of a Mexican and the other was Billy the Kid. In 1967, I was back in the area on business and heard of the old cemetery south of Fort Sumner. I went there, and to my surprise there was a grave and gravestone of Billy the Kid. I went back to town and hunted up an old Mexican who had lived there most of his life and inquired about the new grave of Billy the Kid. He said that was just to get people to come there. I asked about the two graves, and he said they were washed away in the flood of the river. I believe he said it was 1934. He said no one would ever find any of Billy's bones." End quote. In the book, Pat Garrett, the Man Behind the Badge, author W.C. Jameson writes the following about the Fort Sumner purported grave. Quote, "In 1906, 22 bodies, believed to be those of soldiers, were disinterred from the cemetery and reburied in the Santa Fe National Cemetery. Supporting evidence is lacking that the remains of the man Garrett wanted the world to believe was Billy the Kid was among them. On a number of occasions during the past 130 years, the nearby Pecos River flooded, inflicting damage to the cemetery that was located near the adjacent floodplain. High-velocity floodwaters were observed and recorded, carrying away headstones and markers along with coffins and their contents. By the 1930s, as a result of flood damage, there was little left of the cemetery that was recognizable. In 1937, the 4 pallbearers who carried the casket alleged to contain the remains of the man shot by Garrett from the wagon to the grave were still alive and living in Fort Sumner. Vicente Otero, Eno Salazar, Jesus Silva, and Charlie Four were assembled at the old cemetery and asked to agree on the original location. They were unable to do so, each man selecting a different site. Finally, they agreed to compromise by placing a marker at the approximate center of the 4 different choices. The current gravesite of the man Garrett identified as Billy the Kid is an important tourist attraction for the town of Fort Sumner. The location, situated next to an establishment that caters to tourists and peddles souvenirs and postcards, is a long way from the original burial site. There is no proof that Billy the Kid, or anyone else for that matter, is buried under that marker." End quote. In the book, The Dirty on Billy the Kid, author Steve Cedarwall recounts the January 20th, 2004 deposition of New Mexico State Medical Examiner Dr. Deborah Comar, who was investigating on the behalf of the state of New Mexico to determine if Billy the Kid's remains lay in Fort Sumner. Dr. Comar stated that her investigation at Fort Sumner wasn't well received, and she detailed the methods she would apply in locating the body. When asked by attorney Bill Robbins, quote, "You don't think Billy the Kid is buried in Fort Sumner, do you?" She replied, "I don't know. I have reason to suspect. Perhaps not." End quote. In summation, no one is buried under the current grave marker. It is a tourist attraction, nothing more, nothing less. Pretty much everyone agrees that the only eyewitnesses as to what occurred at Maxwell's on the night Billy the Kid was purportedly shot were Pat Garrett, Pete Maxwell, John Poe, and Thomas McKinney. While Garrett and Poe wrote books describing their versions of what happened that night, and Pete Maxwell remained understandably silent on the matter in an effort to distance himself from the event, Thomas McKinney also remained silent. Why? According to his family, he did tell his version of what happened that night, but only to close family and friends. In a letter dated June 29, 1955, from William B. Morrison to William Waters of Covington, Kentucky, Morrison revealed an account given to him by Thomas McKinney's cousin Felix McKinney. He stated that, quote, "Kip claimed to have killed the man by mistake and the kid got away." End quote. He next mentioned a telephone conversation with Thomas McKinney's grandson, stating, quote, "He hoped that I would not tell the same story of the killing as others had done." After relating that his grandfather contended the man was killed on the outside and that the kid got away, I told him that was exactly the way I knew the facts and they would appear in the book as I knew them. End quote. Morrison was later able to substantiate this claim via interviews with Thomas McKinney's son, Cliff McKinney, and daughter, Alva McKinney. Cliff McKinney apparently granted much credence to Robert's claim and, quote, "offered to go anywhere at our convenience and at his own expense to determine if our client was actually the kid." End quote. Ted Andrus, the head of the law firm to which Morrison was associated with during his efforts to obtain a pardon for Roberts, recalled a very interesting story and related it to Morrison. He stated that, quote, "A call came from an elderly man who said he was willing to testify that Kip McKinney had reminded Garrett in a saloon in Uvalde, Texas, that Garrett should know that he had not killed anyone that night." End quote. In a letter dated March 15, 1953, from William B. Morrison to Lou Blatchley, it states, quote, "Mr. Clark McKinney, cousin of Kip, who was with Garrett when they purportedly killed the kid, attended the Kiwanis meeting. After the meeting, he came over and introduced himself, saying that he was well pleased with my talk. He stated in the presence of others that I certainly told the truth when I said that Garrett did not kill the kid. Kip, during a visit within the home of Rufus and the son Clark, told them that they killed the wrong man that night when the kid escaped." End quote. In a letter dated May 18, 1955, from William B. Morrison to Marshall Myers, Morrison recounts a recent conversation with Kip McKinney's grandson, stating, quote, "He did, however, confirm the fact that his grandfather Kip always contended the man was killed on the outside and that it was not the kid." End quote. In a letter dated September 7, 1955, from William B. Morrison to attorney W.T. Moyers, it states, quote, "McKinney's account places the killing on the outside of the house and says that a man was killed by mistake. The kid got away. It is peculiar that Garrett and Poe acquired wealth and that McKinney remained obscure at that time." End quote. In a letter dated May 27, 1955, from William B. Morrison to Edward E. Trivis, Morrison cites the account of another grandson of Thomas McKinney, stating, quote, "Kip McKinney's grandson, Leonard Hoffman, called me as soon as he read the item in the Herald Post before publication of the book, and told me that he hoped I would tell the true story of the killing. He said that Kip always said the man was killed on the outside and that he was not the kid. He was happy when I told him that was the only way I knew the story." End quote. In a letter dated October 3, 1956, from William B. Morrison to E. B. Fowler, Morrison writes, quote, "Kip McKinney always claimed that Garrett never killed anyone that night and that the kid got away. As soon as Alias was announced, Kip's grandson called me and asked how I was disposing of the killing in Fort Sumner. After I told him, he volunteered to assist with research concerning his father's theory of the killing." End quote. In a letter dated August 7, 1957, from William V. Morrison to Frederick Nolan, Morrison writes, quote, "The versions of Garrett and Poe have been generally accepted, but what about McKinney's version? Why did he fail to go along with them? For the reason that Kip always contended that he killed the wrong man on the porch while Garrett was inside and the kid escaped. Kip owned his soul, as he was not indebted to anyone. Both of Kip's grandsons have been working with me since they knew that Roberts told the truth about the killing. I hope to make a tape-recorded interview with Kip's daughter in Colorado. After we filed the petition, a long-distance call came to the law office from an old man in Uvalde, Texas, offering to give a deposition in our case for the reason that he was unable to travel. He knew all about the killing and heard Kip remind Garrett in a saloon there that he should know he never killed anyone in Fort Sumner. All of this gave the answer for Cliff McKinney's reason for wanting to interview Roberts at any time and at any place, at his own expense, to see if Roberts was actually the kid. Cliff knew that his father, Kip, had killed the wrong man, and he wanted to satisfy his own mind. It has never been disputed that Kip was in the posse and that he was the only one who was not shaking in his shoes, but no one has taken the time to check his version. I wish you would ask Rash about this version. Roberts' contention that no coroner's verdict would be found to support their contention that the kid was killed has been proved by the legal records and testimony of persons in charge thereof. His contentions that the wrong man was killed on Maxwell's porch was verified by McKinney and cannot be controverted by any kind of evidence. It should be recalled that Roberts knew nothing about Kip's version of the killing. Kip's grandson called me on the evening the alias was announced for publication, and his only interest was how Roberts disposed of the killing in Fort Sumner." End quote. In a letter dated September 10, 1954, from William V. Morrison to R.N. Mullen, Morrison poses a very valid point regarding McKinney, stating, quote, "After a talk at the Kiwanis Club in Silver City, Kip McKinney's cousin was introduced to me, and he was astounded throughout my talk for the reasons I pointed out the facts as he knew them, with reference to the purported killing of the kid, etc. Then, if Kip's son thought that his father or Garrett had killed the kid, why did he remark in November 1950 that he would be able to distinguish whether or not Roberts was the kid if he could only talk to him?" End quote. In the book, The West of Billy the Kid, author Frederick Nolan writes about McKinney's version of the shooting and the possibility of Garrett killing the wrong man due to his method of ambush-style killing, stating, quote, "Bearing in mind the evidence suggesting that Garrett shot down both Tom O'Fallard and Charlie Beaudry without warning, there is a faint ring of truth to this account. To further muddy the water, however, McKinney's present-day descendants believe his reported statement that Pat Garrett mistakenly shot a Mexican boy in Maxwell's bedroom. After some discussion, it was agreed that the dead boy would be buried that night as Billy the Kid, so Garrett could collect the reward and split with grandfather and another party who had been called in to assist John Poe." End quote. One interesting fact, often avoided by supporters of the historical status quo, is the refusal of the territory of New Mexico to pay Pat Garrett the reward money offered for the capture of Billy the Kid. Initially, Garrett had to rely on personal contributions to compensate him for his efforts. For instance, James J. Dolan presented Garrett with $1,150. John Chisholm reportedly contributed $1,000, and a total of $2,300 was raised in Santa Fe, Las Vegas, Silver City, Las Cruces, and Mesilla. On February 18, 1882, the territorial legislature voted to pass an act granting Garrett relief for the arrest of Billy the Kid. According to C.L. Sonnetson, the legislature was heavily loaded with Garrett henchmen. Amazingly, the act credits Garrett with killing the kid on or about the month of August 1881. In the book, Billy the Kid Beyond the Grave, author W.C. Jameson writes, quote, "Pat Garrett never collected the $500 reward offered by New Mexico Governor Lew Wallace for the apprehension of Billy the Kid. Garrett petitioned for the reward money on July 20th, 1881. The reward was denied by Acting Governor W.G. Rich. According to writer John Tuska, some questions were raised relative to whether Garrett had really killed Billy the Kid. A few researchers claim that Garrett's request for the reward was denied because his application was not in proper legal form. Others refer to the problems generated by the purported death certificate, which was never found. Author Tuska suggests that after Garrett was turned down, Charlie Green, the editor of the Santa Fe New Mexican and a Garrett crony, recommended to the sheriff that he have a new coroner's report, a third one, drawn up. The document was written, according to Tuska, by Pete Maxwell's brother-in-law, Manuel Abreu, and it contains signatures of men who had not been present at the original hearing, and it contains obviously slanted statements, which indicate for what use it was intended. Clearly, Garrett was not beyond being duplicitous and self-serving at the expense of truth. If Garrett had killed the right man in Maxwell's bedroom, none of these ploys would be necessary. To cover up his mistake of killing the wrong man, Garrett hurried along, not one, but 2 inquests, refused to place the body on display, refused to have his photograph made with the corpse, had the body buried post-haste, then almost a week later initiated a third coroner's report. And for what reason? There can be only one logical explanation. The dead man was not Billy the Kid. Tuska states that it is quite possible that the original document mentioned that the kid was unarmed and was therefore suppressed. Tuska also raises the question of whether the coroner's jury, made up of men largely sympathetic to the kid, would have concluded by recommending the reward not be paid to Garrett. Perhaps that is the reason why the original became lost. Since Garrett was the official in charge, he bears responsibility for losing it and orchestrating the second report, the one that was more favorable to him. Given the facts related to the events following the shooting of the man in Maxwell's bedroom and the various inquests, concluding without a doubt that the dead man was Billy the Kid, seem questionable. Given the intense efforts by Garrett and others to circumvent the truth, the likelihood is great that all involved knew it was not Billy the Kid who had been killed." End quote. In his biography, Pat Garrett, The Story of a Western Lawman, Leon Metz brings up the possibility that passing off anybody as that of Billy the Kid could easily have been done and paved the way for Garrett claiming the reward, stating, quote, "Since neither Poe nor McKinney recognized the kid, and both would be inclined to accept almost any body that Garrett claimed was Billy's, Garrett could then petition for the reward, as well as the honor and prestige that went with killing the Southwest's most famous outlaw." End quote. Those that seek to discredit Roberts claim that no record exists of any man by the name of Billy Barlow living in or around Fort Sumner in July of 1881. The supposed proof that Barlow didn't exist or wasn't present at Fort Sumner on the night in question is that he didn't appear on any census records at the time. However, according to author W.C. Jameson in Billy the Kid, The Lost Interviews, he states, quote, "The documentary and photographic truth is, and evidence backs it up, that there were a number of men living in and around Fort Sumner who were not on the census. In addition, there were many on the census that were using aliases, including Billy the Kid. A search for a Billy Barlow was undertaken by a private detective specializing in historical cold cases. A man employing that name was found to be living in the area of Fort Sumner during this time, though his actual name has eluded investigators." End quote. In Alias Billy the Kid, by Morrison and Sonnetson, Roberts told Morrison that he believed that Billy Barlow was merely an alias. Apparently Barlow claimed to be of some relation to the legendary Clements family, to which Manny Clements and the infamous gunslinger John Wesley Hardin belonged. Roberts also stated that Barlow worked on a ranch near Muleshoe, Texas for a short spell. It was here that the two men first became acquainted. Roberts stated that Barlow first came to New Mexico during the winter of 1880 and had not participated in the Lincoln County War and therefore had no enemies. He also remarked that he and Barlow looked very much alike, both being the same approximate size and general description, with the exception of Barlow's beard and a darker complexion. In the book, The Return of the Outlaw, Billy the Kid, by W.C. Jameson and Frederick Bean, Jameson states that C.L. Sonnetson said that Barlow may have been half Mexican. During my communications with various descendants of the Clements family, one possible name is frequently mentioned as being the true identity of Billy Barlow, and that name is Alf Day. There is further evidence to support Roberts' claim of not only Billy Barlow's existence, but that a brief firefight followed the shooting at Maxwell's. The first being statements made by descendants of Paco and Naya, who purportedly served on one of the coroner's juries and who participated in the burial of the man shot that night, and Odelia Maxwell, Pete Maxwell's sister. In an interview published by the Traveling Tourists on October 13, 2017, titled The Santa Rosa, New Mexico Supplemental 2 of 2, the Billy the Kid interview, it contains an interview with John Martinez, who is the great-grandson of A.k.a. Anaya. According to Martinez, Anaya told his family that the man shot by Garrett was a friend of Billy's, who is also named Billy, stating, quote, "The night that Billy was killed, he had a friend that was from Texas. His name was also Billy. They called him Little Billy because he used to imitate Billy. The Hispanics used to call him a puppy dog. He would follow Billy around. He tried to imitate him. He tried to dress like him, his mannerism, the way he walked, everything. The night that Billy the Kid was killed, the history says he was shot by Pat Garrett. He didn't shoot him with a pistol. He shot him with a shotgun in the face. He was hard to identify. In fact, the night that they killed him, they brought him out. They paneled a coroner's jury, which was made up of all of Billy's friends. His compadres, they called them. The leader of the coroner's jury was my great-grandfather, Paco Anaya. He was also the justice of the peace. They brought him out, they put him on a bench, and he was buried by 8:30 the next morning without anybody else seeing the body. The body could not be identified because the face was shot up. The next morning, Billy the Kid's horse, a horse he treasured very dearly, that was given to him by Tunstall, Billy's tack, Billy's saddle, Billy's horse was missing from the corral behind the house, Maxwell's house. The horse that belonged to this other Billy that came from Texas, his horse was still there, and nobody ever claimed him. Later on in the years, I happened to become acquainted with a fellow by the name of Daniel Scurlock. This was a great-grandson to Doc Scurlock, who was a member of the Regulators. Daniel told me that his grandfather, who was the son of Doc Scurlock, had told him they killed the wrong Billy. Dan Scurlock told me so many stories about his grandpa that we were putting them together, and we believe that this fellow from Hyco, Texas, by the name of Brushy Bill Roberts, was really Billy the Kid. He met with other old-timers when he came to New Mexico to visit the governor to try and get a pardon from the governor before he died. And incidentally, the governor would not give him a pardon, and Mr. Roberts died a few days later back in Hyco, Texas. There was a man by the name of Silva, who was an old man who used to ride with Billy the Kid, that met Brushy Bill Roberts, and they compared scars and places, and he really swore that Billy the Kid was still alive. Now my great-grandfather wrote a book in Spanish called I Buried Billy. It was translated by a fellow by the name of Joe Bolin, who owned a big jewelry store in Fort Sumner, and the book is still up for sale. You can buy it anywhere you want, but the best place would be the Billy the Kid Museum that is run in Fort Sumner. In the book, which was translated from Spanish to English, it said in Spanish, I buried a Billy, not I buried Billy, or I buried Billy the Kid. It said, I buried a Billy. Now my grandfather claims, in his later years, that it was all a setup, that Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid were not only good friends, but were like brothers. End quote. He then said he hoped that someday DNA testing could be conducted that would ultimately prove this. He ended the interview by saying, quote, but Billy never died. End quote. In my April 2023 interview with Mr. Jimmy Thomas, the second great-grandson of Odelia Maxwell, Mr. Thomas stated that according to his family lore, on the night that Pat Garrett supposedly shot Billy the Kid, Pat Garrett mistakenly shot the wrong man, whose first name was also Billy. Not with a revolver, as is commonly stated, but rather with a shotgun to the face. Thomas also stated that the man shot that night was buried quickly, and few people were allowed to view the body. Furthermore, he confirmed Robert's account of the gunfight that took place between the real Billy the Kid and Garrett's posse after the killing of the wrong man, stating that not long after the shooting, while Billy was attempting to get away, there was a gunfight that took place a short distance from the Maxwell house, and during this gunfight, while the real Billy the Kid was making his escape, he was hit by gunfire and injured. Thomas also places Garrett not in Maxwell's bedroom when the fatal shot was fired, but rather crouched down on a bench in the hallway, firing towards the front door and porch. There is evidence in the form of the blueprints of the Maxwell home which supports Thomas's account. A major problem with both Poe and Garrett's account of the shooting is how they describe the Maxwell house, and how in their description, both men make it seem as though the open doorway that both Garrett and the man shot by Garrett entered into the Maxwell home led directly into Pete Maxwell's room. However, in the blueprints to the home, discovered in the National Archives, it clearly shows that upon entering the home, both men would have had to walk down a hallway about 10 feet and then turn into a second doorway in order to enter Pete's room near the southwest corner of the house. Furthermore, the claim that the door both men entered was left open has also been called into question. In his book, The Dirty on Billy the Kid, author Stephen Cedarwall states, quote, "In this country, we have skunks. What does that have to do with the shooting of Billy the Kid? It changes the story by a few degrees. Skunks will crawl under any building on the place. They'll find a way into your barn, saddle shop, chicken coop, and even your house. If you leave the door open to your house at night, a skunk will smell food and boldly walk into your house like he's the one making the mortgage payments. In the 1880s, a lot of skunks carried rabies. If bitten, your life was measured in painful days. For these reasons, known to everyone who lives in this country, I have trouble believing Maxwell would have the north and south entrance doors to the house open." End quote. In the book, Pat Garrett, the Man Behind the Badge, author W.C. Jameson noted that in addition to skunks, rattlesnakes were another major concern, as were scorpions and centipedes. Jameson then adds, quote, "In the days before air conditioning, people who lived in environments such as this would leave their windows open to catch a breeze, but never a door. Garrett's mention of an open door is suspicious." End quote. Jameson then goes on to question the claim that the man killed that night wasn't wearing boots, just socks, stating, quote, "To get to the house, the man was forced to traverse bare ground littered with gravel, thorns, thistles, burrs, stickers, and other piercing objects, not to mention the aforementioned rattlesnakes and scorpions that dwelled there. No sane man would do such a thing. Furthermore, socks were considered a kind of a luxury in those days. Many a cowhand went without them. It's hard to believe that one would risk the wear and tear on a pair of socks, as well as on his own feet, by walking across such nasty ground." End quote. We then have the only recorded account of Pete Maxwell. In the June 1978 edition of True West magazine, it contains an article titled "The Bundy Avance Story," in which Bundy Avance recalls meeting Pete Maxwell several years after the shooting at Fort Sumner. The men became friends, and eventually the subject of Billy the Kid's death came up, to which Maxwell mentioned two things to note. The first being that it was not Billy the Kid that was shot and killed by Garrett, and the second being that John Poe wasn't present when the shooting occurred. Maxwell added, quote, "Garrett was pretty well shook up, as he didn't want it said that he killed the wrong man." End quote. Maxwell further stated that it was a Mexican that was killed, and he promised Garrett he'd keep quiet about the blunder. Next, we have some forensic evidence that seems to contradict Garrett and Poe's account of the killing. The headboard from Maxwell's bed, a washstand from Maxwell's room, and the workbench that the body of the man shot that night was laid upon were preserved by Odelia Maxwell. Odelia later passed the artifacts on to her daughter Stella, who passed the items on to her son, Manny Miller. In 2003, Manny Miller granted Steve Cedarwall permission to allow the items to be processed for forensic testing by acclaimed forensic scientist Dr. Henry Lee. According to John Poe, Garrett's second shot had struck the adobe wall and rebounded against the headboard. In the book, Cold Case, Billy the Kid, Investigating History's Mysteries, author W.C. Jameson writes, quote, "So this artifact was examined closely, front and back. It contained nothing resembling the impact of a bullet, not even a scratch." End quote. In the book, The Dirty on Billy the Kid, author Stephen Cedarwall writes, quote, "Deputy John Poe says Garrett's second shot ended up in the headboard, so he wanted to examine it closely. No foreign substances such as stains or blood were visible. There was no bullet hole present. The headboard was examined front and back for any trace of anything out of the ordinary. Nothing was found." End quote. It should be noted that neither the headboard or the washstand contained any traces of blood. That's right, no trace of blood was found on either artifact. They did find a possible bullet hole in the washstand, but no one knows when that might have occurred, especially since according to John Poe, only the headboard was struck. In the book, The Dirty on Billy the Kid by Steve Cedarwall, he writes, quote, "Either Poe didn't go into Maxwell's room after the shooting, or the Maxwell's family is lying about the washstand being the one Garrett shot. The evidence supports the Maxwell family." End quote. The workbench was tested, which had been stored in a chicken coop since 1957 and had 10 dark brown stains on it, of which some tested positive for blood. Dr. Lee took scrapings from the bench, as well as blood samples, and sent them to Orchid Cellmark Laboratory for DNA testing. In the book, Cold Case, Billy the Kid, Investigating History's Mysteries, author W.C. Jameson writes, quote, "The results of the DNA test showed that the blood was from 2 different human beings." End quote. The full report of the artifacts, as well as the history and provenance of the items, can be found in The Dirty on Billy the Kid by Stephen Cedarwall. Keep in mind that according to Garrett, the man shot that night was so close to him that he almost touched him as he leaned over and put both hands on the bed. This occurred right before the supposed fatal shot occurred with a .44 caliber revolver. I contend that considering what we know about blood spatter and blood spatter patterns, that if the shooting occurred that night, as stated by Garrett and Poe, that a significant amount of blood would have come into contact with both the bed and the washstand. And since no blood was found on either of the artifacts, I believe this is strong evidence that supports both Roberts and McKinney's accounts of the shooting. Before closing out this video, I would like to address a few other points often cited by neo-historians. The first being the interviews published in Walter Noble Burns' book, The Saga of Billy the Kid. Those that seek to discredit Roberts often cite Walter Noble Burns' interviews with Paulita Maxwell, Pat Garrett, and others as evidence that Garrett killed the kid. However, author John Tuska in Billy the Kid: A Handbook calls into question the authenticity of the Burns interviews contained in his book. The Saga of Billy the Kid, which was published in 1926, and according to Tuska, quote, "Another of the curiosities about Burns' book is the first-hand conversations he supposedly had with some of the principals in his story. Most, if not all but one of these, were doubtlessly made up in his imagination. The whole last chapter is given over to a lengthy conversation with Pat Garrett, which, given that Garrett was, for everyone who knew him, a man of few words and was dead by 1908, could scarcely have taken place. Others are made to say things about the Lincoln County War which it would have been out of character for them to have said, insofar as other interviews with them provide totally contradictory testimony, and the only purpose served by what Burns quoted them as having said being to substantiate Burns's fantasies." End quote. In the book, Billy the Kid, The Bibliography of a Legend, author J.C. Dyke states, quote, "The quoting of these conversations lends an air of authenticity that is hardly justified." End quote. In the Burns book, Paulita places herself in the room when Billy is given up by her brother Pete, stating, quote, "The night the kid was killed, Garrett asked Pete Maxwell why the kid was in Fort Sumner. Pete shook his head and said he didn't know, but he merely wanted to save Garrett embarrassment. He knew, and I knew. I was standing beside Pete's chair at the time, and I would have answered Garrett's question if Pete, by a look, had not warned me to keep my mouth shut." End quote. This statement alone casts serious doubt on the authenticity of the Burns interview, as these statements are totally inconsistent with other statements Paulita made in the years following the event. For instance, in her interview with Miguel Antonio Otero that was published in his book, The Real Billy the Kid. Furthermore, since the Burns interview places this conversation at Maxwell's on the night of the shooting, and both Poe and Garrett's versions only have them visiting Maxwell's home once on that day, at the time of the shooting, Burns is basically placing Paulita in the room just before the shooting took place. While neo-historians often cite this interview as evidence of the kid's death, they often conveniently omit this quote from the interview. Another name often cited in support of their claims that Garrett killed the kid is Delavina Maxwell, who, according to most accounts, was one of the people to view the body and identify it as being Billy the Kid. The most often cited account is that of Odelia Bernice Finley Johnson, the great-granddaughter of Lucien Maxwell. According to Mrs. Johnson, after the shooting, Garrett and his deputies were afraid to re-enter the room, believing that the man was only wounded and lying in wait for them. After roundly cursing Garrett and calling him a son of a bitch, Delavina grabbed a candle and walked into the room to check on the man's wounds. She quickly returned, crying hysterically. This account backs up Robert's version of the events, as Robert stated that Celsa Gutierrez told him that, quote, Delavina is crying and carrying on, but she knows Pat killed the wrong man. She is pretending, going along with what the men are saying. Your partner looks very much like you in the dark, except for his beard. End quote. In a July 1981 Field and Stream article titled Billy the Kid, the Man Behind the Legend, author E.B. Mann writes, quote, Delavina Maxwell, years later, amended her story and said, quote, It wasn't Billy. I knew it wasn't. So did Pete. So did Garrett. So did the men on the jury. But we wanted to give Billy time to get away. The boy Pat Garrett killed was dead. Burying him as Billy the Kid would end the hunt for Billy. It did just that. End quote. According to supporters of the historical status quo, Frank Lobato was not in the vicinity of Fort Sumner, New Mexico on the evening of July 14, 1881, the night the kid was purportedly shot and killed by Lincoln County Sheriff Pat Garrett. As evidence in support of their claims, they cite a second-hand source given to Jack Hull in the late 1930s. However, in an interview with Miguel Antonio Otero, Frank Lobato stated, quote, Billy the Kid had been stopping with me for several weeks. He came to me after he had escaped from jail in Lincoln, thinking my camp was a safe place. He was with me nearly all the time Pat Garrett was seeking him. We were good friends. Billy would do anything for me, and I would do anything for him. He often rode to Fort Sumner at night, but often returned to the camp before daylight. On the night he was killed, he and I went to Fort Sumner together. We were hungry and stopped at Jesus Silva's to eat. Billy wanted some beefsteak and asked Silva if he had any fresh meat. Silva replied that he had none, but he helped Pete Maxwell kill a yearling that morning. He told the kid that he could get all he wanted if he went over to Maxwell's for it. Soon after Billy left, we heard 2 shots from Maxwell's direction, and Silva and I went over immediately. We found a great deal of excitement. Pat Garrett and 2 other men whom I did not know were standing outside the house, rifles in hand and ready to shoot. Pete Maxwell and the household were standing at the door of Pete's bedroom. Someone had been shot in the bedroom, and we were told it was the kid. End quote. To further substantiate the presence of Frank Lobato on the night of July 14, 1881, one need not look very far. In the same book, by Miguel Antonio Otero, there is an interview with Jesus Silva, which confirms the earlier testimony of Frank Lobato, proving he was exactly where Brushy Bill Roberts said he was. In closing, no credible evidence exists which indicates that Billy the Kid was shot and killed by Pat Garrett on July 14, 1881, or any other time. I believe that either Pat Garrett or Thomas McKinney shot and killed the wrong man that night, and a cover-up immediately commenced, and that Billy's friends helped in the cover-up. Despite contentions made by neo-historians who contend that Billy's friends would never participate in helping the cover-up, I would like to quote from a publication of Western historical scholars, which appeared in an April 1951 article published by the Western States Folklore Society, Western Folklore Volume 10, titled Billy the Kid, A Case Study in Epic Origins by Alfred Adler. Adler, which concluded, quote, The natives cannot be disassociated from the other inhabitants of Fort Sumner who were eager to hide the kid. End quote. I would like to end this video by quoting a letter dated July 4th, 1953, from the legendary Billy the Kid and Lincoln County War author and historian, Colonel Maurice G. Fulton, to fellow highly acclaimed Billy the Kid researcher, historian, and author Robert N. Mullen, which states, quote, Weight of evidence is important in trying to shift fact from fantasy. During my first years of seeking information from old-time families in New Mexico, the one statement I most frequently encountered, one on which there was unanimous agreement, notably among native families, was that the man shot in the dark of Pete Maxwell's bedroom was not William Bonney, later known as Billy the Kid. End quote. If you like my videos and wish to support me in making more videos, you can help grow my channel by liking and subscribing. I'll be back real soon with my next video. Until then, stay tuned, and thank you for watching.